It's a dispute that has predated the crisis in Egypt or the civil war in Syria, and it will likely still be around after those flashpoints have passed. Israelis and Palestinians remain locked in their own conflict, with extremes on both sides refusing to revive hopes of the two-state solution. To some Palestinians, Israel has no right to exist. Some right-wing Israelis refuse to countenance a Palestinian state. Even those who do agree on the need for a resolution can't necessarily agree on the detail. Well, enter US Secretary of State John Kerry, who has travelled back and forth in recent months searching for a breakthrough. We'll bring in Avi-Guy now, policy analyst with the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council. Nice to have you on the program. I want to get your reaction, first of all, to the events that we're seeing throughout the region. In Egypt, of course, the civil war in Syria. We've just brought you that news of that car bomb in Beirut, of course, again, across the border from Israel in Lebanon. How does that make Israel feel with so much instability surrounding them?
Well, if there's one thing that Israel doesn't like is instability along its borders, and it's been happening and going on since the beginning of the uprisings in the Arab world. But having another revolution in Egypt in the past 2 years is definitely unsettling. There are always pros and cons. The security cooperation between Israel and the Egyptian military has been strong because of the mutual interest. No one wants a flare-up. No one wants to see the terrorists in Sinai resuming violence. No one wants to see Hamas resuming violence. And actually, the relative calm between Israel and Hamas, the so-called ceasefire, was achieved because of the Egyptian military. So actually, having more power in the hands of the Egyptian military is not bad for Israel right now. However, obviously, the ongoing instability, the ongoing protests and unrest are not good signs, and unfortunately, it looks like it's not going to stop anytime soon, because the ongoing problems, economic, social, political, in Egypt are not going anywhere, as is the civil war in Syria. So,
and then of course,
that's
if
very
you
unsettling.
look at Lebanon as well, and we've just seen this car bombing the past hour or so. The strength of Hezbollah's intervention in the Syrian conflict, does that also create more concern inside Israel?
Well, I think that in Israel, people are still trying to get a grip and understand what's going on. I don't think that we're usually on such high alert as it is. I don't think that it's a new threat to us. We've known the power of Hezbollah and how well equipped and how powerful they are even before. We said that over and over again, and it's definitely not news to us. And the hopes are that the instability wouldn't spill over to Lebanon and then possibly to the Israeli border, because we've seen in history how it's very easy to, when things go wrong in the Middle East, to point the finger at Israel, and the best thing to unite your own faction and groups is to start some kind of flare-up with Israel. So, but it's not a new concern. So I don't think that another attack or another incident now in Lebanon is going to change that.
Or I want to then turn to your own issue, the own conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. With so much instability and confusion and chaos surrounding you, does this then raise the stakes, increase the incentive to try to revive the peace talks, at least amongst Israelis and Palestinians?
Well, I think that in Israel there were always high stakes in resuming peace talks. There was always, every poll shows, the feeling in the street is that people do want this conflict to end regardless of what's happening around us. But the need for more stability is definitely in the Palestinian front as well. So any chance of negotiations, it's what the government has been saying for years now, and what Israelis have been hoping for a very long time. Unfortunately, like everything has pros and cons. The instability actually poses challenges and threats. For example, in the Palestinian front with Hamas and Fatah, the split between them, and now Hamas losing their allies first in Syria, and now things are a bit more shaky with Muslim Brotherhood not in power in Egypt anymore. So they're going to have to somehow reposition themselves and reevaluate where they stand in this new reality that we're facing. So everything comes with pros and cons. I hope that it does mean that there is more incentive, but unfortunately I think that things are always more complex in the Middle East than they seem or than we would just hope. So,
but the longer that the two sides remain apart, though, is it runs a risk of attitudes hardening. You've mentioned Hamas and some of the issues that they're facing. We've also seen amongst the government in Israel as well some of the more right-wing elements there talking down any prospect of a two-state solution. So is there a risk of attitudes hardening as well on the Israeli side?
Well, there are always on both sides, there are always people that are not interested in a two-state solution, but the reality is that a two-state solution is the only solution. Any other outcome is not really a solution. It's more of an imposed reality on one side or the other, and the majority of Israelis, definitely on the left, but also on the right, do support the two-state solution. The main problem is the frustration and the feeling of hopelessness that it's just not happening, and the frustration with just the stalemate and that we found ourselves in. So, and it has a lot of different reasons to that frustration, but one of them is the willingness of the Israeli government to negotiate without preconditions, while on the Palestinian side, even if you disregard all the mess that's going on in the Middle East, and even if you disregard the split with Fatah and Hamas, even the Palestinian Authority, who is the official leadership and the only negotiator with Israel, still they pose preconditions. They want to discuss 67 borders and to discuss prisoner swaps, and they want a full settlement freeze, which actually unofficially the Israeli government has been imposing in effect since for the past few months, since John Kerry started his renewed efforts. So those demands for preconditions on the Palestinian side, well, the Israeli side is saying we will negotiate anytime, any day, just tell us when and where, is actually now just contributing to that feeling of frustration and disillusionment.
And what can John Kerry do to try to reignite this process? He's been back and forth. He's held meetings that have run for many, many hours with both Mahmoud Abbas and also Benjamin Netanyahu. The US, if the US can't make a difference here, what is going to be the circuit breaker?
Well, you need to ask that on the Palestinian side, because every report, every indication, everything that came out of those meetings on the Israeli side shows willingness to resume negotiation. Now, resuming negotiations doesn't mean that there are no gaps in the positions of the two sides. It doesn't mean that everything is a done deal and resolved, but it does mean that that there is a willingness to negotiate the real issues and not to just negotiate, starting to renegotiate. And I think that to ask that question, it's a very good question, but I think that it needs to be asked on the other side as well, because right now it seems that they're the ones that are unwilling.
Let me just ask then about the approach from the Israelis. You've mentioned some of the preconditions that the Palestinians are looking to. But ultimately, isn't that what this issue revolves around? The big questions of where the Palestinian state would be. Would it be in Jerusalem? Would the borders be based around the 1967 borders? Ultimately, aren't these fundamental? What would the Israelis be prepared to agree to?
Well, we've seen, we don't know exactly what the current government will agree to or not agree to, because they haven't discussed it before, because Abbas refused to negotiate since the beginning of Netanyahu's first term. But what we do know is that there were two offers in the past. We do know that the Arab League's peace initiative is back on the table, and that they have agreed to the concept of land swaps, and they emphasize the idea of mutual recognition. So it's not like there's no framework for discussions. It's not like we're starting from the first, first step. There were already negotiations in the past, but to have preconditions before we even start negotiating, it's something that Israelis, because of the atmosphere of distrust, because of the stalemate, it's something that Israelis are very afraid of, because when we have made concessions in the past and they weren't reciprocal and they didn't lead to anything, and we're not talking about in the far past, we're talking about a couple of years ago when Netanyahu agreed to a settlement freeze for 10 months with the purpose of starting negotiations again, and that did not happen because Abbas refused to negotiate until the very last month, and even then just to negotiate the extension of the settlement freeze. When you have those kind of events in the past, it's very hard to start having conditions to just starting negotiations. So if John Kerry can get the Palestinian side and the Israeli side to just agree to sit down and talk, and again, we're not starting from square one. There were already frameworks in the past. There were the Clinton parameters. There's the Arab League initiative. We know what we're talking about. It's not new concept. It's just that they cannot be set in stone even before negotiation even start.
All right, Avi-Guy, real pleasure to have you on the program as always. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.